fear of the unknown. Perhaps in our current understanding of Lovecraftian horror, no other concept could be as strongly associated with it as what Lovecraft himself described as the oldest and strongest kind of fear. But when considering Lovecraftianism not merely as a set of themes, tendencies, and outlooks reflected in the works of the original author of the genre, but as an entire movement that has been kept alive by the many Lovecraftians who continuously expand, alter, and reiterate its formula, it is still quite possible to come across hints of a somewhat consistent tendency regarding the choice of themes. A form of favoritism on the part of these Lovecraftians when it comes to choosing exactly what kind of unknown is worthy of being depicted as fearsome. In fact, I'd go as far as saying that for these authors, and also for Lovecraft himself, it is not merely the unknown that elicits the strongest sense of fear, but in fact, no unknown could be even remotely as fearsome as what is essentially unknowable. Now, when it comes to encountering the unknown, it is safe to assume that we as human subjects have a wide variety of means to respond to it, which of course includes fear, but is not limited to it. The objectifying process of the scientific method has always served to reduce extremely unique phenomena into systems of universal signifiers and formulae that can be quantified, recognized, and reproduced. And whenever the scientific method fails us, we never shy away from establishing arbitrary systems that still manage to allow us to fit the unknown in relation to a world that is supposedly known, albeit through some leaps of faith, educated guesses, or carefully crafted metaphorical relationships that still allow us to mistake them for literal ones. In fact, as far as a conscious doctrine of knowing goes, one could argue that these makeshift techniques were invented much earlier than the scientific method itself. Either way, it is by no means difficult for us to convince ourselves that we know what we truly don't. In the worst case scenario, we can always fall back to clinging onto relatively older stereotypes that are by no means less arbitrary than whatever we invent today, but their age itself, through a metaphorical maneuver, could grant them the credibility we demand from them. All that is left is the ability to use the same metaphorical maneuvers to project the known onto the entirety of the unknown, or rather to reduce the unknown so that it may fit our pre-existing knowledge. Although thankfully it seems that at least some of us do have the guilty conscience that grants us the capability to reflect upon and acknowledge this whole process. As one of the people who I suspect of attempting to invent multi-purpose hammers has once said, quote, "It is tempting, if the only tool you have is a hammer, to treat everything as if it were a nail." So if we take into account our cunningly convenient, almost genius ways of smuggling the unknown into the known, even at the cost of self-deception and self-sabotage, the true weight of the Lovecraftian author's task becomes evident. The only way to inflict fear of the unknown is to trap the audience in an encounter with not merely what is unknown, but specifically that which is immune to all of our theatrics, that which upon encountering it, we cannot by any means fool ourselves into thinking that we know it, or that we have any chance of ever knowing it. Our fear of the unknown is most pronounced when we have no way of escaping the unknown. Now, I would argue, to identify such an unfathomable reality, the Lovecraftian takes on a grimly Kantian outlook. To orchestrate a conception of that which is impossible to know, there comes a need for not only establishing what it means to know, but more specifically, for the sake of allowing oneself the opportunity to not be able to know something, a need for establishing the limits of human cognition itself. But a limit in itself cannot necessarily impose a sense of horror, but that which is undeniably out of our reach may at best merely impose a sense of hopelessness, although in the case of the Kantian noumenon, it let the idealists of the next generation conclude that it is entirely irrelevant to their lives. Although it is in fact undeniable that hopelessness is essential to the Lovecraftian experience, it is merely one of the symptoms of a much more fundamental disposition, one that does not only concern the existence of an out-of-reach reality regarding an objective world of objects, but one that implies the world of other subjects to be equally out of reach. Imagine the following. You stand before a female praying mantis, eye to eye, undeniably being observed, brought into her world, and being seen as a certain something. However, what you do not know is the shape of the mask that you are wearing. Is it that of a female or a male praying mantis? Are you being seen as an object of desire and possibly emergency food, or just another instance of your observer? It is this question that Jacques Lacan considers to be the foundation of the experience of anxiety, not as an effect, but as a disposition towards the other. And the same question is considered to be at the heart of the psychoanalytic discourse. The neurotic analysant always asks the analyst, "What is it that you desire? What am I to you?" Of course, not in a literal sense, but it is in fact a refusal of answering it that both grants the analyst a special place in the world of the analysant, perhaps that of an eldritch abomination or a female praying mantis instead of just another one, and also guarantees the continuation of analysis. However, regarding the Lovecraftian experience, I'd add yet another question. Are you even wearing a mask? Are you even being seen? With these two questions in our disposal, we finally discover the fundamental condition that both arouses us in terror and breaks us in despair. And what is truly captivating about the Lovecraftian experience is that you can never comfortably remain in one or the other state. Within the Lovecraftian experience, one is neither given the privilege to enjoy the stability brought by the pessimism of living in a soulless, careless, unpredictable, and unknowable mechanical world of objects, nor the opportunity to indulge in a Hegelian battle for recognition against another praying mantis, with all the anxiety it brings. You can neither reduce the world into that of mere objects, nor when facing the other subject you can ask, "What am I to you?" The true terror of encountering an eldritch being does not only arise from an incapability or difficulty in discovering the desire of that being and the demand it poses towards us, which would put us in a state of anxiety instead of terror, but it is in fact the very possibility of a lack of any desire or demand involving us on the part of the other. Still, we're also denied a stability found in despair, for the Lovecraftian experience does not merely imply a total lack of any form of discourse or any sense of desire or subjectivity on the part of the world and the other, but a refusal. The eldritch beings are conscious, they observe, they desire, and they are capable of both relating to the world and acknowledging the relations that other subjects have towards them and towards the world. The battle for recognition and the intersubjective push and pull of desire is present, perhaps among the eldritch beings themselves, but the terror arises from the fact that we humans are entirely excluded from it. We're not merely mourning for the idea that there is no intentionality behind the world, or that we are separated from it in such a way that we cannot discover it. We are in terror, but that we know for certain that the world has no intention of even acknowledging our existence, even though it is perfectly capable of doing so. We are neither merely mourning for the absence of the other, or trembling in the anxiety of not knowing what the other wants to do with us, but in fact, both the anxiety and the despair, the terror, comes from the fact that the other has nothing to do with us as fellow subjects. The eldritch being has to be incredibly kind to assume a sense of desire and subjectivity on our part, but for the most part, the Lovecraftian horror is a horror of being reduced to an object. It's not that the eldritch beings exist in a universe separate from us, for we are always under the influence of their whims, but what is horrifying is not only the fact that we cannot resist their influence, but that we cannot even voice our discontentment. When facing an eldritch god, we see ourselves as having been already eaten by the praying mantis, truly devoured by it, dissolved within it, and already an extension of it. What constitutes our subjectivity is otherness, is the structuralism granted to us when we divide the world into mutually exclusive parts that can be considered to have relations to each other exactly because they are separate beings. It's a separation from the other, and an acknowledgement of separate desires articulated through separate voices that allows us to be subjects with our own desire articulated through our own voice. The eldritch god does not acknowledge our voice, and thus our existence as desiring subjects. Through objectification, we become mere extensions of the will of the cosmic world, and this, with the help of Lacanian metapsychology, easily explains the madness that follows. Encountering an eldritch being does not merely cause a mental breakdown, but a breakdown of thought, language, cognition, and subjectivity. The eldritch god throws us into a state akin to psychosis through imposing a regression to the pre-Oedipal state, a state within which we were never castrated, never separated from the other, and as such, we never recognized our existence as a separate being. The radiance of the eldritch god melts us back into a primordial soup where we exist as organisms devoid of a voice. As we dissolve into the world, so does the difference that constitutes both the structure of speech and that of cognition, and with it falls apart what Lacan called the symbolic order, where a subject of speech and desire is originated. Our senses and our cognition provide us with both an image of the eldritch god and an intuition of its existence. From among Lacan's three registers that could be considered the dimensions that constitute human existence, the eldritch exists both within the real and the imaginary, but as unfathomable as it is, through refusing to take a position within the symbolic, that is to assume a relationship with the subject and to make itself known within a discourse, the eldritch god undermines the entirety of the symbolic order, which not only undermines subjectivity, but leads to what is considered the very definition of psychosis, a disentanglement of the three dimensions. Looking back at our premises, we realize that encountering that which leaves us no means of convincing ourselves that we know it, or that we have any chance of ever knowing it, is indeed a direct encounter with the real without being able to signify it and give it a place within the symbolic. But in such encounters with the eldritch beings depicted in Lovecraftian works, taking refuge in the imaginary is also out of question, for the image that the eldritch being presents to us is so undeniably alien that it rules out any possibility of knowing it through identifying with it, that is, through projecting our pre-existing assumptions onto it. Indeed, our fear of the unknown is most pronounced when we have no way of escaping the unknown, which within the Lovecraftian framework is achieved through trapping us within the real. Incapable of clinging onto the imaginary or the symbolic, we are left face to face with an unknowable reality that refuses to represent or to be represented within our world of known representations, ultimately dissolving this world alongside the place we have assumed for ourselves within it, only leaving us with an image of the eldritch other devouring it whole. In the end, even though the audience never truly encounters such creatures, and even though their world and their place within it is left intact, this imaginary fantasy of being devoured is enough to throw us into the depths of anxiety. Still, the metapsychological assumptions behind Lovecraftianism leave us with a problem regarding Lacanian theory, that for Lacan, it was impossible for a neurotic to become a psychotic. Should we take the Lovecraftian outlook as an indication that it is indeed not impossible, or that what we call a trauma is just a glimpse of psychosis, experienced by the neurotic subject as it fears being devoured by the other? Either way, I'm out of time. What is love? This is not necessarily the question I want to ask, or to investigate the possibility of answering. But what intrigues me about it is the fact that it's very much a question that we escape into, a trap that we set up for ourselves, even when it's not laid out for us. Or in the case of Carver's shorter story titled What We Talk About When We Talk About Love, a trap that we willingly give into even when we are faced with a cautionary tale that literally depicts those who likewise fell or gave into it. It's tempting to consider Carver's piece as a work that poses the question, what is love? Or that attempts to investigate whether there is an answer to it or not. One might think of the piece to be about love, but make no mistake. What we talk about when we talk about love is not necessarily synonymous with what love could be. Raymond Carver's story throws us into a scene of dialogue. We are told that there are four people drinking and talking about love. We do not know them, nor do we know how they ended up bringing up the subject. But what we do know is that one of them, the cardiologist Mel McGuinness, is arguing for the existence of a form of true love. Now, such an argument has a potential to be heavily loaded with ulterior motives. The very idea of true love implies a variety of assumptions. First, an ontological one that argues there exists such a universal phenomenon called love, which has universally recognizable features that distinguish it from other phenomena. That the word love refers to an objectively recognizable reality, and that the abstract concept of love has a very specific equivalent in the world of external phenomena. The second assumption can be considered a conclusion driven from the first one, that whenever various phenomena, collectively called love, cannot be reconciled with each other, we are faced with a misuse of the word. There is a correct way to use it, a correct set of behaviors, emotions, and interactions that it refers to, and that there are people who use the word incorrectly, calling love what isn't love. Such an argument could be easily seen as an exclamation of authority, although the concept of true love itself doesn't automatically grant anyone the authority to define what counts as true or fake love. We quickly see Mel seizing it for himself. The seemingly humorous yet dry opening line already gives away the privilege that Mel enjoys and others grant him when it comes to speech, but also in a sense illuminates the true focus of the story, speech. What immediately follows is indeed a confirmation of the assumptions we have hypothesized behind the concept of true love. Mel's second wife, Teresa, recounts the aggression and violence directed towards her in the name of love by her previous husband named Ed, just to be interrupted by Mel's authoritative voice. Teresa believes it was love, albeit in a different language. Mel does not. But within the party, it is only Mel who so willingly exclaims such a decree, as the other two members, Nick and his wife, Laura, withdraw from making a judgment on the basis of not knowing the particular characteristics of Ed or the situation that he was involved in, which in a way does imply that there is a possibility to find within those variables a justification for calling Ed's behavior love. Of course, Mel tries to justify his stance by implying that there are different kinds of love this time, and that there is a specific kind that is mutually exclusive with Ed's kind of love. This stance is later what we see Teresa draw upon, in reaffirming that she isn't trying to imply that Mel does not love her, but that Mel merely loves her in a different way. But this stance is also something that Mel doesn't consistently preserve, as we see him throughout the story constantly flirting with his original takes, stating that he is not interested in Ed's kind of love, while at the same time questioning whether it actually was a kind of love, all the while abstaining from giving a proper definition of what he considers love, which ultimately denies the others the opportunity to examine and criticize it. What's important to see here is the fact that we can already sense a lack of good faith regarding the matter of love. Among the four, Mel is the only one who actively seeks to discredit Ed's behavior, and he seems to have something to gain from making a distinction between himself and Ed. Not only we see him constantly shift his stance for a strategic advantage in the conversation, we also see him deliberately and actively try to redirect it, most vividly when the topic of Ed's suicide is brought up, claiming that he will explain how Ed bungled up the attempt when asked, mentioning the pistol Ed used for that purpose, before delving into a 245 words long rant about how the pistol was bought to threaten him and how he spent his days afraid of being shot by the crazy lover, ultimately answering the question only after being asked twice more. But this supposed lack of good faith on Ed's part is not the only element that clouds up the flow of the conversation. Throughout a dialogue that's supposed to be about love, we do not see a single definition given. As if scared of making a statement that could later be scrutinized, the parties involved merely resort to recounting examples when faced with a question. Teresa draws upon Ed's supposed commitment as a sign of love. Nick and Laura merely go through the gesture of kissing as an attempt to define their love, which of course is merely a gesture that's supposed to express or represent love. and the now drunk Mel, even after going through a rant of how none of them know anything about love, which of course was done in a way that implies there are objective things to be known about it, insists that he will tell everyone what true love is, only to tell the story of an old couple that he deemed to possess this true love and nothing more. But Mel's impassioned speech does confirm one of our earlier assumptions, that his conception of true love is a response to his desire and inability to reconcile all that which is called love, which in his case is an inability to acknowledge the feelings he once held for his previous wife, as he currently does his best to openly express his hatred towards her. It is thanks to this confession that we can infer the true function of the concept of true love for Mel, as he uses it to discredit the love he had for the ex he hates now. The confession that he, quote, doesn't know anything about what happened to his previous sense of love is conveniently followed up with a story that is brought up as if being posed as the answer to the paradox he has stated earlier. The story of an old man who, after an accident involving him and his wife, falls into deep depression simply because, while bedridden, his broken bones didn't allow him to turn his face and see that of his likewise bedridden but rapidly recovering wife. Still, throughout the story, we do not necessarily see love, nor do we hear possible definitions of it. We see nothing but signs, signs which in themselves could be signifying anything but love, and for which we lack enough context to make a sound judgment about. Ed's willingness to wager his life and the depression of the bedridden old man could both signify codependency and an obsession with appearance respectively, as much as the constant gestures of love exchanged between Nick and Laura, but more interestingly and more frequently between Mel and Teresa, could be interpreted as hollow gestures and attempts at reassuring the other party, attempts which were driven by a sense of insecurity. It is such an ambiguity caused by a deliberate lack of context that gives this piece a distinctly postmodernist connotation, in which, instead of discussing a certain signified, in this case being the concept of love, the multitude of its signifiers are given the center stage, basically replacing the signified concept altogether. But to me, compared to such a connotation, the more striking element was the particular life of one such signifier within the story, and the development this gesture of love is depicted to go through as the conversation goes on, by which I'm referring to the term honey. From the earlier stages of the discussion, we see the word being constantly and exclusively exchanged between Mel and Teresa, which, funnily enough, are the main sources of the conflict that carries the conversation. The term honey, or its shortened form hun, was repeated 10 times within the exchanges between these two, alongside a wide range of subtle or explicit hints pointing at a sense of conflict in their interactions. As we watch their conversation go sour with various traces of sarcasm on Teresa's part, and the increasingly drunk Mel becoming increasingly quick-tempered in his responses to them, the couple remain the only people who continuously and almost ritualistically use the term, as if to constantly reassure each other of their loyalty in the face of the conflict between them. Throughout the text, the term was used 12 times in total, 10 times between Mel and Teresa, and once by Mel directed towards Laura, as he states that he'd marry her if he didn't have Teresa on his side, which to me doesn't seem like a nice thing to say when your wife is right next to you, even when you're drunk, especially right after reacting passive-aggressively to one of her jokes. The striking point, however, is the first time the word is used by someone other than Mel and Teresa, which is, even more interestingly, the last time we hear it near the end of the story. It is Laura who utters the term when asking her husband the meaning of one of his last lines, as if, due to exposure to Mel and Teresa's interactions, she contracted the idea that the term honey is used when there is a perceived distance between you and the person you're talking to, and that it's a way to patch up this distance and put a veil on uncertainty. But yet another striking point, one which seems to point at yet another source of uncertainty within the conversation, is the second time Mel attempts to forcefully change the topic, albeit this time seemingly to avoid what he himself had planned to say all along, as he suddenly cuts short his recounting of the story of the old couple to instead talk about how he wants to be a knight in another life, leaving it unfinished. Although it could be reasonably argued that he is simply too drunk to stay on topic or to avoid it in a deliberate maneuver, I simply can't help but notice that not only the story was very much left in a cliffhanger, leaving his argument without a conclusion, but that it also invited more requests from his audience to continue it. Furthermore, upon finishing the story, Mel visibly expresses extreme frustration at the state of the old man, leading to a sudden sense of gloominess which, of course, could be taken as a symptom of alcohol intoxication, only as far as explaining the extremity of the reaction goes, as it doesn't seem impossible for such an example of true love to instead elicit a sense of extreme enthusiasm from the drunk man who advocates it. Either way, the sudden interruption in his speech and the sense of frustration that follows do grant us even more clues regarding his relation towards his grand example of true love. We could on one hand interpret the entire thing as a part of his theatrics to elicit curiosity, appeal to the emotions of the audience, gauge how interested they are in his speech, or to indulge in the pleasure of having people repeatedly ask him for his wisdom. Or if he is too drunk to deliberately avoid the conclusion and the gloominess it brings, he should also be too drunk for such theatrics. All of that leaves us with one possible solution to explain his general reluctance to properly showcase what true love is, even if only through an example. He most likely does not believe that he has it. The old man's longing for the face of his wife is obviously what Mel admires, if not longs for. He ritualistically insists on how he loves Teresa, which perhaps he does, but it is impossible to ignore that it's a different kind of love compared to the particularities of what he cherishes as true love. He's stuck with an unattainable fantasy that successfully functions as a way to solve the paradox regarding his and his wife's previous partners, but both triggers a sense of privation and at the same time unconsciously discredits the kind of love he has for Teresa. In the end, we see that Carver's piece is not entirely a story about love or one that depicts it, but as the name implies, it's a story of people talking about a variety of ideas, which of course includes love. The question, what is love, is essentially different from the question, what do we talk about when we talk about love, to which we could respond in a variety of ways. Perhaps it's merely a signifier, an abstract idea signified by various gestures, a fantasy, or merely an essentially contested concept. But as for which one's the best response, I'm out of time. When it comes to the accounts of mass political purges, assassinations, exiles, or various schemes and conspiracies, typically attributed to power struggles, the actors involved in such events are typically seen in a light of apathy, and although there seems to be little done to support this assumption, we often jump into the boat when it comes to linking the air of paranoia revolving around such events to an assumed state of psychopathy and lack of compassion on the part of the actors. The dehumanization of the oppressive tyrant is a pleasant result of such an assumption, allowing one to draw a fundamental distinction between oneself or one's group with those whose excessive use of violence and manipulation seems to suggest that they only treat and see human life as valuable insofar that it proves valuable as a means to their ends. In essence, such a dehumanization of the heartless tyrant is only possible through accusing the tyrant of another form of dehumanization. However, the problem of such an assumption becomes evident once the air of cruel, cold, and practical professionalism is replaced by frantic, fearful expressions of violence seemingly fueled by guilt and suspicion. Shakespeare's Macbeth is often seen as a prime example of such a tyrant, although he certainly was anything but heartless, and at the same time anything but professional, and his long soliloquies often adored as deeply relatable expressions of guilt, distress, despair, and doubt, alongside his almost silly rationalization of his childishly superstitious optimism, which ultimately proved to be his undoing, do more than enough when it comes to depicting a human all too human. But while most of the audience engaged with this work most often occupy themselves with the theme of ambition and consider his bizarre likability as just an instance of Shakespeare's magic, it is truly in Throne of Blood, Kurosawa's highly original adaptation of Macbeth, where such a potential for a deeper analysis of the mechanisms behind a sense of empathetic paranoia is actualized. Throne of Blood might be called a cinematic adaptation of Macbeth by many, but putting aside the differences in the historical contexts of the aforementioned works, Kurosawa boldly states from very early in the movie that his work is truly his, and not just an interpretation of Shakespeare's. It only takes us a few minutes of watching the film to encounter the first and arguably the most important point of diversion for Macbeth, which cleverly foreshadows and states all the things that will be stated by Kurosawa, which were not said by Shakespeare. What could be seen as an amusing interpretation of Macbeth, that being the three witches who prophesied Macbeth's rise to kingship, being attracted to him because of his hidden desire for the crown, is explicitly stated as an obvious reality in Throne of Blood, just as is the desire itself. Shortly after the fateful encounter with the Mononoke that divined their futures, and while reflecting upon the bizarre experience as they rest before reporting back to their lord, Washizu, the Macbeth of Kurosawa's work, likens the encounter to a frightening dream as he tries to express his haziness to the Banku of the story who is named Miki, only for him to reply in a solemn, sorrowful yet matter-of-factly tone that men often dream of their desires. The most striking contrast between Kurosawa's world and Shakespeare's, however, is only revealed to us hereafter, as Miki, continuing in the same voice but now with a hint of bleak empathy, recounts that anyone would dream of ruling over such a mighty castle, referring to the stronghold belonging to their lord. From this simple recollection, we could already get a sense of why the film is not simply named Washizu in the same manner that Shakespeare named his play after his character, but was rather named after the place pursued by many, where many have and will face their downfall. While in Shakespeare's work we see but one usurper who takes over the throne of Scotland just to hand it back to the bloodline it belonged to, Throne of Blood is a story of the many usurpers whose blood paints the throne of Kumonosujo, the spider's web castle which from the very beginning of the film was not even housing its original master, a fact that we are informed of by Washizu's wife, Asaji, as she attempts to push her hesitant husband to actualize the prophecy that he actively tries to undermine, in a stark contrast to the self-consciously power-hungry Macbeth we know of. In fact, unlike the Macbeth that so willingly promises her wife of great fortune, Washizu attempts to actively resist Asaji's urging, as she tries to gaslight him into acknowledging the desire in his heart, justifies it, as Miki did, by stating that anyone would wish the same, and also by recounting how their current master, Tsuzuki, was too a usurper. Here, Kurosawa presents us yet another theme prevalent throughout the film, which is most pronouncedly signified by a specific phrase, one that is recapitulated at the very end of the story in a manner that beautifully resembles the introduction, development, and recapitulation of ideas in classical music, especially the sonata form. While arguing with his wife, Washizu's last line of defense seems to be the idea that Tsuzuki's usurpation was justified as he had no other choice to protect his own life, but murdering Tsuzuki would be high treason, an argument to which his wife simply responds with reminding him that Washizu's life too is in danger, as Miki could any moment conspire against him by recounting the prophecy to Tsuzuki, framing Washizu as a traitor, a threat that later became more evident, with Asaji interpreting Washizu's new mission to lead an assault while Miki is left to keep watch on the spiderweb castle as a hint of favoritism, if not an attempt to get rid of Washizu altogether. This constant reversal of the master-slave dialectic, resembled by the necessity of the death of a lord for the survival of the subordinates, is repeated 3 times throughout the story. Once with the murder of the previous lord of the castle by Tsuzuki, another time with the murder of Tsuzuki by his subordinate Washizu, and one last time the murder of Washizu as the new lord of the castle in the hands of his very own soldiers, who choose to take Washizu's head instead of fighting his overwhelming enemies. An act which Washizu condemns once again as high treason, just to be reminded by his own soldiers that he himself had committed one such treason, a conversation that conspires exactly like the one with his wife, in which he is reminded of the murder that Tsuzuki was likewise guilty of. The constant struggle between those who rule and those who submit to the rule, albeit while constantly desiring to usurp it, is also masterfully represented by the place which is both where much of the fighting takes place and is also the fundamental cause of much of the fighting. The spiderweb castle, which itself changes hands 4 times throughout the story, is shown to be very much non-existent at the very end of the film, replaced only by the grave of the man who had viciously killed over it. The metaphorical interpretation that the delicate spiderweb ultimately fell apart after taking too many victims could be rather far-fetching, but the scene of a desolate desert replacing the grand castle strongly supports the notion that the constant conflict led to nothing but utter destruction. Although unlike in Macbeth, it was a destruction and conflict entirely fueled by a sense of ambition and greed that was universally felt by all those who gazed upon the castle, alongside the sense of suspicion universally felt by all those who ruled upon it. Indeed, the fundamental difference between Macbeth and Throne of Blood is the fact that the tragic flaw, or the vice that was exclusive to only a specific tragic villain in Macbeth, is but a universal fact of human existence in Throne of Blood, and it is exactly this fact that perfectly illuminates the mechanism that relates empathetic identification to paranoia in Kurosawa's work. One only needs to act upon a certain desire in order to acknowledge both the existence of the desire within others and the possibility of them likewise acting upon it. Washizu's ambition and his fear of death not only led him to eliminate his master, but it also allowed him to recognize the same ambition, the same fear, and the same desire to kill the master in his subordinates, although this time an intent to kill that was aimed towards him as the new master. Were he a more self-conscious man, he could perhaps recognize the existence of such a murderous urge within himself even before acting upon it, but after actualizing the murderous fantasy himself, he robbed himself of the ability to wholeheartedly dismiss it as just an unrealistic fantasy. The horror truly ensues once the empathetic tyrant begins to consider others not merely as objectified means to an end, but as subjects who are out of his reach due to his own subjectivity. That which is desirable for Washizu could also be desirable for others, and that which he is capable of killing for, others could also kill him for it. It is through empathy that he is capable of projecting his own experience onto others, allowing him to recognize and acknowledge similar feelings, urges, fantasies on their parts. But at the same time, it is thanks to an acknowledgement of the existence of others as other subjects that he is eternally incapable of guaranteeing whether a certain person will act upon those urges or not. While empathy, the act of projecting one's ego onto the other and recognizing one's sense of self through the imaginary other, enables him to hypothesize the possibility of others experiencing or pursuing the same fantasies as him. His acknowledgement of the existence of others as the symbolic other, as subjects of desire, speech, and freedom, takes away from him any chance of certainty regarding his relation to them. That is, as long as they are alive. And so it is that the murderous usurper confirms the possibility of murder through first-hand experience, a threat that upon being recognized in others can only be thoroughly diffused through physically eliminating it. And it is in this way that for Washizu, empathetic identification fuels paranoia, and paranoia fuels murderous intent, as the only surefire way to eliminate for certain the assumed murderous intent that he now sees in others, albeit merely a reflection of himself. Of course, although Kurosawa removes all of the famously emotional soliloquies that made Macbeth relatable, Washizu's constant expressions of confusion, hesitation, helplessness, the signature manic optimism in the face of impending doom, alongside his pitiful early attempts to protect his ideals of loyalty and dignity, make him far too different from the stereotypical ruthless tyrant that kills methodically for practical purposes. We as the audience might grant him that much humanity, if not pity him. In the end, this universalizing of the desire to kill and to usurp is entirely possible through the domain of imaginary identifications, which, assuming one agrees with its actuality, allows us to understand how paranoia could be caused by the same psychological processes that allow us to experience a host of other emotions, from compassion and pity to envy and rivalry. But Kurosawa does not depict his tyrant as merely a melancholic man who has entirely given up on humanity in a Hobbesian manner, although one could assume Throne of Blood to be depicting the state of nature within which the all-encompassing Leviathan is all too absent to grant words such as high treason or loyalty, any kind of political weight or moral value. Washizu is depicted much more as a man who responds with disbelief upon encountering himself in the guise of the other, struggling with a constant sense of anxiety rather than a sense of calm, chronic misanthropy. This anxiety itself, which is the primary source of a tyrant's frantic, fearful expressions of violence, is only possible through the acknowledgement of yet another domain of human existence. While empathetic identifications allow the tyrant to accept and acknowledge the presence of fantasies and ambitions similar to his own in the hearts and minds of his subordinates, the immense anxiety is caused not by an understanding of this fact, which, by itself, could also trigger a sense of misanthropic withdrawal from the world of humans, but the tyrant encounters it upon acknowledging that he is existentially incapable of acquiring any sense of certainty and objective understanding of human subjects. While the suspicion is present, and is aimed at all those who live, it entirely remains merely a suspicion, constantly tormenting the paranoid tyrant with his inability to judge with certainty whether an actual threat is present or not. As such, empathetic paranoia is not only caused by a projection of one's own image of oneself onto the other, but also by understanding of the fact that the other entirely rejects such projections. The tyrant's desire to kill the other is in a very Sartrean manner caused by his desire to reduce this objective other into a literal object, which would allow him to judge the other objectively. Alas, such an extreme attempt at the objectification of the other is only necessitated by the fact that the threat which the other poses towards the tyrant is one that threatens his very existence. In a way, just as Tsuzuki, Washizu, and Washizu's soldiers each killed their respective masters hoping to guarantee their own survival in doing so, the intention behind a paranoid tyrant's extreme desire for literal or more abstract forms of objectification could be fueled by a desire to prevent himself from becoming the victim of such objectification. Asaji explicitly articulates the same dilemma as she tells Washizu that there can be no peace, that one has to either await their own destruction or destroy the other to prevent it. In the end, although Asaji could be seen as a perfect embodiment of the Macbethian ambition, it is an existential threat and a paranoid anxiety that ultimately compels Washizu to act upon his desire to usurp, an element which was entirely absent from Shakespeare's work. Kurosawa's, however, is a unique depiction of the Sartrean idiom that one fashions mankind through fashioning oneself, and of the fact that the death of the other triggers a vicious, obsessive cycle of literal or metaphorical slaughter, preventing dialectical progression. I wish I could elaborate more on these, but I'm an idiot. Kurosawa's conceptual innovations, namely his depictions of empathetic paranoia, alongside the desire to kill the other, introduce a host of philosophical discussions to his work that could be deemed too far-fetched to be related to Shakespeare's Macbeth. The former could be considered not only an act of scrutinizing the moral primacy of empathy as one of the main mechanisms behind the moral ideal of compassion, but also a perversion of the Kantian categorical imperative. Although Kant believed that analyzing an act from the perspective of whether it could or should become a universal law could allow us to judge its moral value, we see this idea turned over its head and squeezed dry of its moral weight in Kurosawa's world. A world in which every action of every man is at the same time a statement of the righteousness of the said act. A world in which all the new attempts at usurpation are justified by those of the predecessors. Every act of usurpation is seen as a statement that universally justifies and permits it for others, just as Suzuki's initial usurpation did. The ensuing paranoia is natural. Still, Kurosawa's subversion of the categorical imperative could be interpreted as a cautionary tale about a world that does not consider it. The spider-web castle is ultimately reduced to ashes as a result of the aforementioned universal permission. If usurpation itself was judged in the lens of the categorical imperative, it would indeed seem too destructive to be permitted universally. But the moral primacy of empathy is not only scrutinized in regards to the Kantian moral outlook, but also in regards to how it leads to a perversion of Hegel's master-slave dialectic and the interconnection of the two forms of perversion. While Hegel's dialectic begins in a death struggle similar to what is depicted in Throne of Blood, for any form of progress to be achieved, it is necessary for the battle to end right before the death of one of the parties, subordinating one through compromise to the other. Only after this state is secured, the progressive reversal of the dialectic becomes possible, as the servant reaches self-consciousness through their labor, while the self-consciousness of the master is entirely dependent upon the labor provided by the servant. In Throne of Blood, however, the simultaneously literal and symbolic murder of the other not only cuts short the progressive trail of the dialectic, but also, through claiming the murder to be a universally permitted right, sets precedence for its repetition. And so it is that the perversion of the Kantian categorical imperative in Throne of Blood leads to a perversion of the dialectical progress of history, as it triggers a neurotic cycle of obsessive violence that simultaneously reinforces itself as it grinds itself towards its own destruction. And it is in this light that one can see Throne of Blood not as the history of a usurper, but the story of a throne perpetually tainted by the blood of those who kill for it, slowly walking towards its own eventual death. Or as the Japanese name of the film implies, it's the story of a spiderweb castle that traps and devours its masters, and a spiderweb forest that, just like Iwashizu's eventual doom, eventually moves to engulf its victim within. A fragile spiderweb upon which history halts and human beings stagnate as the rapt preys of their own heart, with all its empathy and ambition. So far, we might have established that the dehumanization of tyranny might not necessarily be an accurate depiction of it. But when it comes to such grave matters, there is no such a thing as harmless simple-mindedness. The actual damage of such dehumanization is not only a pleasant detachment from reality, but the fact that it renders us incapable of acknowledging and addressing the inherent tendencies of humanity towards destroying itself. Furthermore, while one might think that humanizing a tyrant could amount to excusing their tyranny, it is in fact through relating their evident moral shortcomings to some mythical idea of psychopathy that their actions can be morally excused. as the responsibility is put on some supposed mental structure or emotional disability rather than the agency of the actor. After all, the fact that Kurosawa's work explicitly presents itself as a cautionary tale against ambition is itself an acknowledgement of the assumption that any of us could choose to unveil and nurture our tyranny, with our empathetic hearts merely fueling the ensuing paranoia. One does not need to be heartless in order to be monstrous. Everything has already happened. The flame is already fading, the night has already begun, the lords have already abandoned their thrones, and the Elden Ring has already been shattered. No matter which one of the famed soulsborns we pick, upon our arrival in the world, such is its state. Stalemate and stagnation, as if history itself has come to a halt, refusing to acknowledge any of the things that happen as we play, for they are seemingly too insignificant to be remembered by it. Indeed, despite the immense richness that the worlds we play possess in names that made history, names that we will certainly remember, no one in the history of those worlds seemed to remember that of ours, or any of the fellow undead Ashen Ones, hunters, or tarnished that we might stumble upon for that matter. It's as if we are but visitors, wandering in a museum where time has frozen, a graveyard where all of history is seemingly present at once, but only in the form of decaying runes and tombstones. And this is how Elden Ring most truly resembles our age. Of course, when it comes to medieval fantasies, attempts at resembling real ideas, attitudes, figures, or institutions alongside their relations and conflicts is nothing new. And although Soulsborns have always been brimming with rich histories that, despite being fictitious, are seemingly driven by real conflicts, they are hardly the only works that do so. However, what truly allows Soulsborns to resemble our contemporary life better than any of their contemporary works is the way they present their histories to us, an element entirely dependent upon the contemporariness of their medium, thanks to which merely depicting a certain fictional history or the story of certain characters witnessing it is no more the only way to present that history. In Soulsborns, we do not meet hallowed gods, but at best discover their hallowed corpses. Neither can we interact with any institutions except through their decaying ruins. We rarely witness any historical events in these games, but might at best discover their marks, given that we put in the effort. Soulsborns do not provide us the experience of living within and through history, but that of living after it. In this sense, among all Soulsborns, it is Elden Ring that best provides us that experience, largely thanks to its greater emphasis on limitless exploration, an element which perfectly complements the aesthetic of Rune through introducing to the image the figure of the romantic wanderer, a wanderer who is as affected by history as he is alienated from it, who although might choose to piece it together, can also completely ignore it, and even if he does decide to trace it, he will be at best stumbling upon remainders of now decaying cathedrals or castles that merely signify a long-lost glamour. Remainders that signify historical events, but themselves are nothing but signifiers. Such signifiers are the main instruments using which Elden Ring presents us its history, not through depicting it, but through leaving its marks dormant throughout the lands between, waiting to be stumbled upon by one such wanderer. As such, Elden Ring might not merely resemble human history through mirroring its general direction, the nature of its conflict, or specific figures and events, but most importantly, it resembles the contemporary experience of relating to history itself. The experience of living in an age that seems to not have a proper name and is not necessarily dominated by any central idea or conflict, but is instead shattered between countless representations of all the ideas and conflicts that have existed throughout history. Ideas which, although are now more accessible than ever to all of us, remain dormant until stumbled upon. Naturally, each of us stumbles upon different bits and pieces, bearing our own shards while remaining oblivious or even at conflict to the rest, leading to a state of affairs in which the causal chain of progressive history is seemingly shattered, with various epochs existing in parallel to each other rather than leading to one another. Alas, just as in the lands between, all the epochs are seemingly present at once, but only in name. For the contemporary individual, the experience of history is one of exploration and discovery, but merely among the ruins of the past. All that can be discovered from any given epoch is merely its signifiers, its decaying remains, its records, its enthusiasts, their attempts at imitating or interpreting it, and so on. The burial grounds are vast and the ruins are plentiful, perhaps making it more appealing to wander through them for ideas to pillage than to come up with anything new. But in contrast to how we might indulge in whatever remains and shards we find, it is only the romantic aesthetic of ruin, so beautifully given a new life in Soulsborne, that truly does them justice, as mere signifiers that, although could signify a lost glamour, simultaneously articulate the fact that it was indeed lost. Remainders and ruins of a greater whole, resembling its greatness through metonymy, but simultaneously lacking it. Nonetheless, just as many of us still indulge in our little shards and get lost in dreamy idealizations of various cherry-picked episodes of history, so do many of the characters we meet in Soulsborne, leading to a decentralized, polyphonic landscape, resembling a problem play where the world is shattered in a constant dispute between representatives of various epochs, a dispute that seems to have been grinding towards a stalemate. It is as if Soulsborne depict a world where the postmodernist project has already thoroughly succeeded, having dethroned the old lords and principles but allowing no replacements, a decentralization of history that provides a platform for all of history to be given a new chance for deliberation. In Soulsborne, it is such a decentralization that constitutes the state of the world as we play, a point in history which, in Dark Souls for example, can neither be called the Age of Fire nor that of Dark, or for Dark Souls 3, a state where the dark is still sealed away by the flame, but remains a constant threat as the Lords of Cinder refuse to reclaim their thrones. And indeed, among the ruins of the shattered worlds of Soulsborne, it is always the nameless romantic wanderer who is truly the kingmaker. But the role of this kingmaker is best articulated in Elden Ring, where unlike the first Dark Souls, the choice is no more merely between two opposing forces. It is not merely whether to uphold the old order or to begin anew, as even those who choose to repair and perpetuate the lost, centralized order of the world are bound to disintegrate as they are faced with several contending choices. In a stark contrast to the first Dark Souls with its total of 2 endings, among the 6 different endings that Elden Ring presents to the player, 4 of them are devoted to various ways of restoring the Elden Ring to power, through literally modifying the ideological principles of the Golden Order. An abundance in contending ideological deviations and interpretations that not only further emphasizes the decentralized state of the lands between, but also illuminates the philosophical and linguistic nature of its disputes. In fact, Even the fundamental principles of the Golden Order are presented to us as linguistic functions. In the world of Elden Ring, the Golden Order is interpreted by the fundamentalists in terms of the contrasting powers of regression and causality. Regression is defined as the tendency of all meaning towards converging into a unified state, while the structural relations between multitudes of meanings and how they are linked to each other is termed causality. Considering the definitions that Elden Ring provides us for these two concepts, it is by no means difficult to imagine their dichotomy to be mirroring that of metaphor and metonymy in structuralism, with the latter being the way that signifiers relate and lead to one another, linking them in the chain of signification, while the former allows for one signifier to entirely replace another, leading to the convergence of their meanings. Such an interpretation of the Golden Order already reinforces our earlier reiteration of the lands between as a graveyard of signifiers, but deliberating the specific naming of these two principles will even further illuminate the philosophical nature of the Golden Order. If we are to conceptualize a relationship between metonymy and causality, we could consider metonymy to allow for the conception of causality through making it possible for one signifier to lead to another while both remain distinct from each other, a distinction that is necessary for any causal relationship to be articulated. In Elden Ring, such interconnection of rationality and language is also articulated in the description of the law of causality spell, an interconnection that is a prominent theme in both structuralism and post-structuralism, with one example being Jacques Lacan's symbolic order, which, as one of the main aspects of human subjectivity, is not only responsible for the emergence of the subject of a speech, but also any notion of law and order, including rationality and causality. However, for convergence to be termed regression and posed as a force distinct from causality implies that any movement towards a more unified state is necessarily a movement backwards. Such an implication also conveniently lines up with Lacan's imaginary order, which, in contrast to how the symbolic defines the subject in relation to the other, gives rise to fantasies of returning to a state of unity, an illusory state of wholeness that is assumed by the subject to have been preceding the division of the world into countless signifiers during the emergence of the symbolic order. However, such a unified state would precede the emergence of the subject too, making it resemble some form of a primordial wholeness similar to the One Great, an entity who, in Elden Ring, gave birth to all things that exist in the world through itself getting fractured and divided. Alas, similarities between the lore of Elden Ring and the ideas of Lacan are many and already investigated by others, but what is important to us concerning the way in which Elden Ring presents its history is the fact that the Golden Order is depicted as a set of statements already contradicted by what we uncovered earlier regarding the lands between, its post-historic and parallelistic state. If the law of causality is that of the natural course of history, in which various signifiers, ideas, or epochs are supposed to sequentially lead to one another, in the lands between they instead exist in parallel and in conflict with each other. While the law of regression argues for signifiers to move towards convergence, in the lands between they are prevented from doing so, thanks to being engulfed in a deadlock that cannot be broken by any single one of them. A deadlock which, although at first might seem like a chaotic state of stagnation, is the perfect stage for the re-emergence of the romantic wanderer, the post-historic player who, as all of history seemingly comes back from the dead to be judged, will be there to judge their shattered remains as the decaying ruins that they are, rather than merely the lost glamour they might signify. Nonetheless, in previous Soulsborns, this wanderer usually had to make a choice among the contenders opposing each other within this stalemate. In Elden Ring, however, one might be able to choose all at once, while choosing none. Soulsborns have always presented such nameless wanderers as the ultimate kingmakers, perhaps thanks to the romanticism that allows them to unify and accept all the epochs through the aesthetic of rune, while simultaneously staying detached from any single one of them through acknowledging that they are but runes. But in Elden Ring, this romanticism itself, this all-encompassing night, can be chosen to reunite the shattered world without venerating or stepping on any single one of its shards. While use of 19th century romantic imagery such as the full moon, medieval runes, or vast seas are nothing new in Soulsborne, it is only in Elden Ring that this aesthetic viewpoint itself, which also entails a specific attitude towards the world, is presented to us as a possible direction for it. The ending, called The Age of the Stars, is by no means a choice made among the contenders of this stalemate, or one that attempts to return the course of history to its previous order by crowning another signifier, idea, or order as the center of the world, but one that celebrates the very parallelism of the post-historic age. Age of the Stars is the only ending in Elden Ring which truly leaves the lands between on its own, not only through keeping it safe from the hands of the Greater Will, but most importantly, through introducing into the world an age of uncertainty that itself has a finite life, alongside an order that, in a stark contrast to all the variations of the Golden Order, neither seeks to rule nor claims to be eternal, but exists merely to prevent any one order from eternally ruling upon all. As such, it not only puts matters onto the hands of those who live in the lands between, but also allows them to determine the direction of their world according to their own will, by granting them the privilege of a decentralized, uncertain present that leads to an uncertain future. After all, it could not be called a lonely voyage into doubt and darkness if it did not lead to yet another uncertain age. Naturally, such a voyage, embellished with so many romantic themes, can only fall upon the shoulders of the romantic wanderer. In a way, Ranni's order is itself one that both perpetuates and celebrates the lack of any centralized order, all the while bearing the most romantic symbol of all, the full moon that, in our own history, was once venerated as a way to rebel against the eternal golden order of the Enlightenment, is once again presented to us in an entirely new form, as a way to unify and revive a shattered world that is now but a graveyard of the past. In an age when all of history is seemingly present at once, only the chill night that encompasses all can truly accept and succeed all, allowing for all of the stars to shine at once, a night which itself shall be succeeded by a new day. This is the new romanticism that Elden Ring presents to us, the Wanderers, as a path to a new age, stretching into darkness with all its fear, doubt, and loneliness.